Have you ever looked at your child and thought, where did we go wrong? You raised them, cared for them, gave them the best you could, and yet now that they're older, they barely speak to you. They avoid phone calls, ignore texts, or maybe they only reach out when they want something. The warmth is gone, replaced by distance. Or worse, hostility. If you've ever sat in your living room wondering how your own child could seem so cold, you're not alone. And more importantly, you're not to blame. Today, I want to talk to you heart to heart about something difficult but very real. When adult children with deeply self-centered and entitled behaviors turn against the very parents who raise them. It's a painful subject, especially for those of us in the later chapters of life who just want peace, connection, and maybe a little appreciation. But understanding the reasons behind their behavior can help you release guilt, make sense of what's happening, and find emotional freedom. Let's begin with one of the most overlooked truths. Children who are highly self-absorbed, manipulative, or emotionally entitled often have a deep problem with your emotional stability and innocence. That might sound strange at first, but stay with me. When you are calm, consistent, and carry a quiet strength, it can feel threatening to someone who thrives on control and drama. If you've always been the steady hand in the storm, the one who didn't shout back or get swept up in emotional chaos, that strength may have irritated them more than you realized, because they couldn't shake you, because you wouldn't stoop to their level. They saw that as weakness or even rejection. Your emotional maturity highlights their emotional immaturity, and instead of rising to meet you, they retreat, sometimes with resentment. Even your natural innocence can be a target. You may have approached them with honesty and hope, not manipulation or games. But for someone who's grown to rely on emotional tactics, like guilt tripping or passive aggression, that kind of genuine spirit feels uncomfortable. They may not know how to engage with someone who doesn't play along. So instead of softening in your presence, they harden. And over time, that hardening turns into emotional distance, or even open hostility. But it doesn't stop there. Your independence can also push them away. That's right. Being strong, self-reliant, and unwilling to be controlled can make you a threat in their eyes. You might have thought, if I give them space, they'll respect me more. Or, if I don't interfere, they'll appreciate my boundaries. And in a healthy relationship, that would be true. But in the eyes of an adult child who is deeply self-centered, independence isn't seen as respect. It's seen as defiance. Maybe you decided not to offer unsolicited advice. Maybe you learned to say no when they demanded something unreasonable. Or maybe you chose to start living for yourself after years of putting them first. Instead of applauding that, they saw it as abandonment. They accused you of being selfish, cold, or out of touch. In reality, you were simply choosing peace. But peace isn't profitable to someone who thrives on control. There's a quiet power in being a parent who doesn't beg, chase, or plead. And unfortunately, some deeply self-centered children resent that power. They'd rather you be dependent, apologetic, and easy to manipulate. When you're not, when you stand tall in your truth. They may twist the narrative, casting you as the villain simply because you dared to grow stronger. Then come the moments, those important, defining moments, when you finally stood up for yourself. Maybe it was the time you pushed back against unfair treatment, or the day you calmly said, "Enough is enough." For some, it might have been the decision to stop tolerating the yelling, the guilt trips, or the emotional roller coasters. Whatever it was, that moment of self-advocacy might have been the last straw for them. Children who are extremely self-focused don't handle boundaries well. To them, your no doesn't mean no. It means, how dare you? They take it as a personal attack. They might accuse you of being mean, unloving, or even abusive, when all you did was draw a healthy line. It's a painful irony, The more you try to heal, the more they accuse you of hurting them. And if you've ever been blamed for things that weren't your fault, things you never even said or did, that's not uncommon. They might rewrite history to protect their ego, painting you as controlling, cold, or unavailable, even if you were the one who held everything together for years. Don't let those false narratives weigh on your heart. The truth is, the moment you began to value yourself enough to say no, they saw a version of you they couldn't control anymore, and that scared them. Of course, as time went on, your world may have expanded too. You started forming connections outside of them, maybe with neighbors, friends, your church community, or even a support group. And guess what? They didn't like that either. You were no longer centered around them, no longer orbiting their emotional needs. You had other voices speaking life into you. People who saw your goodness, people who affirmed your strength. And that, my friend, is often enough to make a deeply self-centered child turn away. They don't want to share you. They don't want to compete with others for your attention, affection, or loyalty. Even your happiness, if it doesn't include them, can feel like a betrayal to them. It's hard to imagine, I know, but sometimes when you begin to thrive, they begin to unravel. Not because you're doing anything wrong, but because they no longer hold all the power. You may have been told that you're selfish for having friends, or judged because you chose to go on that trip, join that book club, or spend your holidays differently. The truth is, you're finally living, and that makes them uncomfortable. You've built a life that isn't centered around their moods, their schedules, or their approval. That's freedom. But to them, it feels like rejection. It's a strange kind of grief. To lose connection with a child you raised, especially when you've done your best. But the grief is not yours to carry alone. You didn't fail because they pulled away. You didn't fail because they twisted your boundaries into betrayal. Sometimes people change. Sometimes they get lost in their own dysfunction. And sometimes, all you can do is step back and protect your peace. What matters most now is that you don't lose yourself in the process. You've lived too much life, given too much love, and weathered too many storms to let one broken relationship define your worth. There's a strength in you that's still standing, and it deserves to be honored, not diminished. Now that we've opened this conversation and looked at some of the reasons why deeply self-centered children might turn against their own parents, let's continue exploring this in more depth. Sometimes the hardest part isn't just the silence, it's realizing that the silence was chosen. When your adult child starts avoiding you, not because they're too busy, but because they've made a decision to pull away. It can feel like a cut that never fully heals, and you sit with questions that keep you up at night. What did I do wrong? Why don't they want me in their life? If you've wrestled with those thoughts, I want you to hear this loud and clear. You are not crazy, and you are not alone. As we continue unpacking why deeply self-centered children often turn against the very people who raised them, there's one pattern that shows up more than we'd like to admit. It's when your needs become inconvenient to them. Now that might sting to hear, but let's talk about what it really means. See, when you raised your children, you probably poured yourself into them without holding back. You stayed up late when they were sick, helped with school projects, bought what they needed, even if it meant sacrificing for yourself. You were the steady hand, but now that you're older, maybe you need some help. Not a lot. Just a little understanding, maybe a ride to an appointment, a phone call to check in, or even just someone to listen. That's not too much to ask, is it? But to an adult child who is deeply self-centered, even your smallest needs can feel like a burden. Why? Because in their mind, the focus is supposed to stay on them. The moment it shifts. When you ask for something, when you express an emotion, when you show vulnerability, it disrupts the image they have of you as a never-ending giver. And instead of meeting you with empathy, they retreat with annoyance. You may have heard things like, "I don't have time for this," or "You're too needy." even though you've barely asked for anything. Maybe they roll their eyes when you talk about your health or your finances, or maybe they avoid conversations altogether if it requires them to show up for you in a real way. The painful truth is, children who are self-absorbed often only want relationships that serve them. When that dynamic flips, even slightly, they get uncomfortable, sometimes even angry. And so, you start shrinking yourself. You don't mention your bad days. You pretend everything's fine. You tiptoe around them just to keep the peace. But let me gently remind you, relationships built on fear, silence, or one-sided effort are not healthy ones. You deserve better than to feel like a burden for simply being human. Now let's talk about something even deeper. There may have been times in your life when you shined. Whether it was your kindness, your career, your community involvement, or just the way people loved being around you. You didn't ask for attention, it just happened naturally. Maybe people said you had a warm presence, or that you made others feel seen. Maybe your grandchildren adore you, or your friends always call you for advice. But if your deeply self-centered child saw that, they may not have celebrated it. They may have resented it. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Some deeply self-centered adult children can't stand when their parents receive attention or validation that isn't coming from them or focused on them. It's not about whether you're bragging or showing off. You could be the most humble person in the room. But the moment someone else appreciates you, compliments you, or recognizes your worth, they might feel like you're stealing their spotlight. You may have noticed it during family gatherings. Maybe when someone gave you a heartfelt compliment, your child suddenly changed the subject or made a snide comment. Or when others praised your cooking, your talents, or your wisdom, they acted cold or dismissive. It wasn't about the compliment. It was about the attention, not being directed toward them. This is something often seen in people with fragile egos. A deep sense of offense they feel when someone else receives admiration, love, or even basic respect that they believe should belong to them. You becoming the center of attention, even for a brief moment, can trigger that insecurity. And instead of handling it with maturity, they often respond by punishing you emotionally. You might not even realize what you did wrong. You were just being yourself. But to them, it felt like competition. And the more you shine, the more they pull away. They don't want to be reminded that other people see you as valuable, because deep down, it challenges the story they've told themselves about who you are. But here's the truth. Their story isn't your story. Their perception isn't your reality. Just because they refuse to see your worth doesn't mean you don't have it. And just because they withhold love doesn't mean you're unlovable. Sometimes the problem isn't that you're too much, but that they are unwilling or unable to accept the fullness of who you are. That leads us to something many parents don't see coming. Over time, as you age and become wiser, your circle tends to grow. You may reconnect with old friends, find comfort in faith, join new communities, or build meaningful relationships with grandchildren, neighbors, or support groups. And in these spaces, you feel seen, valued, uplifted. But your deeply self-centered child may not like that. They see these new influences not as sources of joy, but as threats. But because if someone else is speaking into your life, offering support, or becoming a trusted presence, they no longer control the narrative. They lose their grip. And to someone who is used to having emotional power, that feels like betrayal. You may have been told, "Don't listen to them," or "They're just trying to turn you against me," even when those people were simply kind and helpful. You might have felt pressure to choose sides, even when there were no sides to pick. That's what deeply self-centered children often do. They isolate, they manipulate, and they use guilt as a leash. But you're stronger than that now. You've earned the right to surround yourself with people who treat you with dignity. You don't need to apologize for seeking joy, or for accepting kindness, or for growing beyond the version of yourself they're comfortable with. That growth is sacred. That peace is priceless. I know it hurts when your own child doesn't cheer for you. It's the kind of pain that words can't always describe. But I want you to hear this from someone who truly sees you. Your story doesn't end with their disapproval. You are allowed to rise, to connect, to belong, and to live a life that's full, even if they choose to stay empty. Let's keep going. There's something especially heartbreaking about realizing that the more you grow, the more your child pulls away. And not because you did anything harmful, but because you started living in your truth, loving who you are, building a life that doesn't revolve around pleasing them, and refusing to let their moods control your day. That kind of self-respect can upset someone who expects everything to be about them. It's not just the freedom you've found that unsettles them. It's the influence others now have in your life, influence that used to belong to them. Maybe you've got new friends at church who speak into your life with wisdom and care. Or maybe a neighbor checks in on you more often than your own child does. Perhaps you've been attending workshops, support groups, or just enjoying conversations with people who value your story. And little by little, you've stopped depending on your child for emotional validation. Now here's what you need to know. Children who are deeply self-centered don't want to share influence. They want to be your center, your only source of affirmation, your emotional lifeline. When someone else steps in to fill that space, even in the smallest way, they may feel threatened. Not because you've done anything wrong, but because you're no longer so easily controlled. They might accuse you of turning against them or listening to outsiders. But what you're really doing is rebuilding your life. And that's not betrayal, that's healing. It takes courage to surround yourself with people who treat you with the kindness you may not have received at home. And it takes wisdom to realize that the world is still full of love, even if your child has chosen to close their heart. So if you felt torn between keeping peace with your child and being honest with yourself, let me gently tell you something. Peace built on silence, guilt, or fear isn't peace at all. It's survival. And you deserve better than to spend your golden years walking on eggshells, afraid that one wrong word will make the phone calls stop again. You have the right to connect, to grow, and to be influenced by people who lift you up, not tear you down. That doesn't mean you don't love your child. It means you're learning to love yourself too. By now, you may be feeling a heavy mix of sadness, anger, or even relief. That's okay. This isn't an easy topic. And for many of us, it brings up decades of pain that we've kept buried. But the reason this conversation matters, especially at this stage of life, is because you deserve to spend the years ahead in peace, not confusion. You might be wondering, is there any hope for reconciliation? And that's a question only time and circumstance can answer. But here's what I believe with all my heart. You do not have to wait for your child's approval to start feeling good about yourself again. You don't need their validation to live fully, or their permission to be proud of the life you've lived. If you've done your best, and I believe you have, you can walk with your head held high. You may not have been a perfect parent because no one is, but perfection was never the requirement. What your heart needed and still needs is acknowledgement. And maybe the only person who can give you that now is you. So take a moment and breathe. Think about everything you've survived, the sacrifices, the lonely nights, the times you held your tongue just to keep the peace, the birthdays they forgot, the one-sided conversations, the holidays you spent staring at the phone. You've been through more than most people know, and yet here you are, still standing, still trying to understand, still hoping, even now, for a little bit of love. That says something powerful about who you are. You're not weak for wanting connection. You're strong for continuing to show up for life, even after so much silence. You're wise for recognizing unhealthy patterns, and you're brave for choosing not to be defined by them. If your child ever finds their way back, let it be on healthy terms. Let them meet the version of you who knows their worth. Let them see the you who no longer folds under guilt or self-doubt. Because you have nothing to prove. You've already proven yourself through every act of love that was never returned, every boundary you've had to build, and every tear you've wiped away alone. And if they never come back, if that relationship never finds its way to healing, I want you to know, you are still complete. You are still worthy of joy, laughter, connection, and peace. There are people out there who would be blessed just to know you. People who will value your stories, who will lean in when you speak, who will look you in the eye and say, "You matter." And if you haven't met them yet, don't worry. They're out there. Sometimes they come in the most unexpected ways. A stranger at the grocery store who shares a smile, a neighbor who offers to help with the yard, a new friend who sees the wisdom in your years. Keep your heart open, not for what's lost, but for what still can be found. This season of life is not the end of your story. In many ways, it's just beginning. And no matter who has walked away, you still have something beautiful to offer. Your insight, your kindness, your patience, your ability to love deeply, even when love wasn't returned the way you hoped. If this video speaks to you, I want to invite you to share your story in the comments below. There's strength in knowing we're not alone, and chances are your voice will help someone else feel a little less lost today. If you found comfort in this message, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to Strong Elderly Life. This channel is here to walk with you through every stage, reminding you that it's never too late to heal, to grow, and to reclaim your joy. You are not invisible. You are not forgotten. And you are not too old to be valued. Here's to living your best life at any age. One peaceful, powerful day at a time.